Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're diving back into some American Civil War, specifically a video that has been requested ever since it came out, and we're going to dive into it today. This is Matt Walsh and what schools don't teach about the Civil War. Now, my last video reacting to Matt Walsh concerning history did not go particularly well in terms of how I felt about it. I felt like it was being very misleading and had quite an agenda. I'm hoping this one will be less so, but I'm not optimistic, especially because I have something that allows me to see thumbnail changes over time, and I can see that one of the thumbnails that was originally used for this video had the Army of Northern Virginia's battle flag, which people often refer to the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag, if you don't know, is actually the Army of Tennessee's battle flag. The square version of that flag is the Army of Northern Virginia, and that was on the original thumbnail. So having a Confederate flag as your thumbnail doesn't make me optimistic that you're going to be unbiased in your view on the American Civil War, but I will withhold judgment until we dive into this one. So I'll put the link in the description. This is an hour and 7-minute original video, and you know me, I love to talk about the Civil War, and we're probably going to have a lot to say. So I expect this will be at least 2, maybe even 3 parts to do all of this. So don't expect this to go quickly. With that in mind, I do want to give a shout out and a thank you to James Glazebrook, who signed up as a patron last month. I really appreciate it, James. Thank you so much. Let's get into this one.
On the night of January 2nd, 1864, Confederate General Patrick Cleburne was worried. He warned his fellow Southerners that surrender to the North, quote, means that the history of this heroic struggle will be written by the enemy, that our youth will be trained by Northern school teachers, will learn from Northern school books, their version of the war, will be impressed by all the influences of history and education to regard our gallant dead as traitors, our maimed veterans as fit subjects for derision. Cleburne.
Now, understand that Patrick Cleburne was Irish-born. He settled in Arkansas when he came to the United States, had been here for maybe a decade or so, was anti-slavery, and had actually proposed that the South emancipate their enslaved men in order to enlist them in the army to fight. And he was essentially blacklisted for that. I mean, it was so horrific to most of the leadership in the Confederacy that he would even dare consider emancipating the slaves, that it effectively stunted him from further promotion. He was probably one of the best generals the Confederates had.
Was only partly right. For most of the following century, non-Southerners were pretty fair about the war and openly respected the South's leaders, including Lee.
4 top Americans in the past. They are Franklin, Washington, Lincoln, and Lee.
The South erected statues and monuments to its heroes. Several were erected inside the United States Capitol.
Many of these statues, though, let's distinguish between ones that were built in the years after the war to honor these men and ones that were deliberately constructed during Jim Crow and during segregation, and they made no secret of the fact of why they were constructing them to reinforce white supremacy in the South.
Even abroad, people respected the dignity, bravery, and brilliance of Robert E. Lee. Winston Churchill described Lee as one of the noblest Americans who ever lived and one of the greatest captains known to the annals of war. It was almost exactly 1 century after the war, in the 1960s, when things took a turn. But even then, it wasn't immediate. In 1977, the Southern rock band Lynyrd Skynyrd performed in Oakland, California with the Confederate battle flag as their backdrop. In 1988, Hank Williams Jr. released a top 10 hit called If the South Would Have Won. But during the woke upheavals of the last decade, the story really changed, and the statues and flags started coming down. Even conservatives in the South had turned on Southern heritage.
It's time to move the flag from the Capitol grounds.
Never should have been there. The Confederate flag, battle flag of any of the armies, any of the Confederate flags, should not be flying on government property. Put it in museums. Have it on display to represent those armies when you're talking about the war, fine. But it's a flag that represents a rebellion against the United States government.
150 years after the end of the Civil War, The time has come.
The retreat opened the floodgates for anti-American radicals who literally desecrated the grave of Robert E. Lee's horse, melted his statues, and slandered his reputation.
Listen, let's not equate being opposed to honoring the Confederacy with being anti-American. Those are two different things. Is there overlap? Are there people who are very hostile toward the United States who also happen to be pro-Confederacy? Absolutely, but let's not assume one is the same as the other.
Confederacy, the American Civil War, it was an act of rebellion. It was an act of treason at the time.
Yes,
the current
it was.
Understanding of the Civil War, as it's taught in Hollywood and schools and everywhere else.
I mean, that is just an objective fact. So is the fact that the formation of the United States in 1776, that was an act of treason and an act of rebellion. I don't know why that should be a controversial opinion to hold.
Cartoon caricature.
I can't breathe. Robert E. Lee represents to me.
The last 10 years have been a master class in historical malpractice, so jaw-droppingly stupid that, honestly, most sane people would just change the channel and call it a day.
I'm sane.
But here we are.
I think.
Obligated to tell the truth, so here it goes. The Civil War is not nearly as black and white as the schoolmarms wish it were.
That's true.
It was one of the most complicated events in American history.
I'll pause right there and just say he's absolutely right. It is very complicated. The one thing I will caution against, and I'm not even assuming he's going to do that, but we need to be very careful about pulling out one example of something and proof texting, so to speak. In other words, you start with an assumption and then you find proof of that assumption. So, for example, making the argument that all Confederate generals were noble men who hated slavery and just wanted to have a country of their own or defending their home. Yes, that's true for someone like Patrick Cleburne. That's probably true for Robert E. Lee, even though he was a slave owner himself. That doesn't mean it's true across the board. So picking and choosing individual stories to make an argument, hopefully he doesn't do that.
Its heroes, who existed on both sides, were complex, multi-dimensional people.
True.
Over the course of this video, we're going to prove it. This is the real history of the Civil War. Imagine serving as an infantryman in a battle where your enemy outnumbers your side 2-1. And not only that, your enemy is better trained. They're well rested. And to make matters worse, they've caught your regiment and your entire army in a pincer. They have a massive number of soldiers behind you and in front of you, perfectly positioned.
Yeah, and imagine they're led by someone who behaves so incompetently that his subordinate generals are losing their minds over the fact that he won't fight, because that also was true about that battle.
As an infantryman in this scenario, all you can do is follow orders, march where you're told to march, and shoot when you see the enemy. So that's what you do. Then imagine that after a week of the most intense fighting of your life, you realize that your side has somehow emerged victorious. In fact, you've won decisively. You don't remotely understand how it happened.
I would push back a little bit that Chancellorsville was a decisive victory. It was a very winnable battle for the Union, even after the masterful flank attack by Stonewall Jackson. Listen, nobody is denying that Chancellorsville was a moment of brilliance for Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. But it was also a moment of major failure by Joe Hooker. He got concussed very early on in that battle and was kind of out of it after that, and probably should have stepped aside and passed command on to his next in line, which I think was probably Darius Couch. But he didn't. The Union very much could have won that battle. If Grant or Meade had been in command at Chancellorsville, Lee loses that battle despite the opening brilliance.
You thought it was impossible. Well, that was the experience of a Confederate soldier named Dorastus Myers during the Battle of Chancellorsville, which lasted from April 30th to May 6th, 1863. On May 11th, Myers, who served as a sergeant with the 33rd Virginia Infantry Regiment, wrote a letter to his brother
Brigade.
and sister. Quote, "The Lord hath crowned our arms with another glorious victory. I think it was one of the hottest contests of the war. The enemy were strongly entrenched. We fought them on the left at Chancellorsville with 40,000 men against 110,000. I never was under such a fire of grape shell canister and
It was more like 60,000 and 130,000 altogether, but in the aftermath of these battles, the men never knew the numbers. It was all basically what they heard and what they thought.
musketry in my life, though the Lord spared my life." Although the Confederacy lost more than 13,000 soldiers at Chancellorsville, as well as several key officers, including Stonewall Jackson, the battle is widely considered to be the greatest Confederate victory of the Civil War and one of the most impressive military victories of all time.
I will not dispute that. It was, like I said, a moment of brilliance by Lee and Jackson.
The historic victory was the result of the leadership of Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. It's widely regarded as one of the most brilliant tactical victories in American military history, often called Lee's perfect battle. It's referenced in books like the West Point Atlas of American Wars, and it continues to be studied in military academies today for its demonstration of outmaneuvering larger forces through audacity and tactical ingenuity.
And listen, it could have been viewed as really stupid to divide your army, which Lee did, in the face of being outnumbered 2-1 already. I mean, there's a lot that could have gone wrong. But it's true in any battle, right? You need a combination of skill, but also some luck and some incompetence on the other side. And yeah, I'm not going to dispute that Grant enjoyed that as well in Vicksburg, for example. It was a combination of skill, but also some luck and also some real incompetence on the side of the Confederacy. So Lee and Grant both enjoyed that at different times.
In other words, Robert E. Lee was a genius.
No. Winning a brilliant victory, we can't say, in other words, Robert E. Lee was a genius, because we need to take the entire scope of the war. And Lee also displayed, I think, some real deficiencies when it comes to a strategic understanding of the war. There were times that he made choices. Look at what happened 2 months later at Gettysburg. I mean, Gettysburg never should have happened in the first place. He never should have invaded the North. Both of his invasions of the North got turned back. But Pickett's charge, the assault on July 3rd, we call Pickett's charge. It was Longstreet's assault. It was 3 divisions, only one of which was Pickett, and only one of which was actually Longstreet's. But and Longstreet was protesting it the entire time, and Longstreet was absolutely right. So I don't know if I'll go the genius route with Lee, but we can acknowledge that Chancellorsville was brilliant.
So who was this man who, more than 150 years after his death, is still so frequently talked about? Robert E. Lee was born in 1807 into a prominent Virginia family as the son of Revolutionary War hero Henry Light Horse Harry Lee. From a young age, it was obvious that he was a military genius. He graduated second in his class from the United States Military Academy at West Point.
I wouldn't say it was obvious that he was a military genius. It was obvious that he was very disciplined. He finished second in his class. His son would later finish first in his class. And it's because Lee just not only was a great student, but also very disciplined and just didn't get demerits, hardly ever. So he was always destined to have some kind of a leadership role. He was always seen very highly in that way.
0 demerits over 4 years and was commissioned into the elite U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. For over 2 decades, he served as an exceptional military engineer, overseeing critical infrastructure projects for the federal government. He served in the Mexican-American War, where he performed so well under fire that he was promoted to colonel. After the war, he ran West Point and later commanded cavalry units in Texas.
So he was second in command to Albert Sidney Johnston in a cavalry regiment, and then, of course, later leads the troops that fight John Brown.
A decade later, in 1863, he found himself fighting the very army that he spent 3 decades serving. Many of the officers he commanded and fought against were students at West Point when he ran it.
Yeah.
He needed a victory at Chancellorsville because he needed European support to break the naval blockade. His enemies sought to destroy Lee's army and reunite the country.
And listen, at that point in the war in May of 1863, European recognition was not happening. Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The war was being reframed, not only to preserve the Union, but also to once and for all eliminate the cause of the disunion, which was the institution of slavery. And so they're using this war to do both. And European nations are not, at this point, going to jump in on the side of a confederacy that is defending the institution of slavery.
The odds were in favor of the Union. Lee's men were facing starvation in Fredericksburg, and he had just split his forces up.
I wouldn't say they were facing starvation yet. This is still, fairly early in the war.
James Longstreet and roughly 20,000 soldiers away to Suffolk to defend Richmond and secure more supplies. As the Union Army converged on Chancellorsville, they had a substantial numerical advantage. Union forces began crossing the Rappahannock River in late April, laying pontoon bridges just south of Fredericksburg. At the same time, another Union column was marching east, crossing the Rapidan River. Roughly 70,000 Union soldiers ultimately converged at the Chancellorsville Crossroads, moving towards Fredericksburg and the rear of the Confederate Army. Meanwhile, Hooker left a force in front of Lee at Fredericksburg under General John Sedgwick.
Yep.
It was clear that a massive battle was brewing. On the evening of April 29th, Jedediah Hotchkiss, a topographical engineer on Stonewall Jackson's staff, remarked, tomorrow, death will hold high carnival." Faced with a vastly inferior strategic position, Lee had three options. Option one, he could attack Sedgwick's forces, roughly 40,000 men along with artillery, that were directly in front of him at the Rappahannock River. But if the fighting lasted too long, the Union could move from the west and destroy the rear of the Confederate Army. Option two, he could retreat and head south to consolidate his forces. This was the safest maneuver, at least in the short term. Option three, he could split his forces and send Jackson's corps to the west while leaving some small divisions at the front line holding Sedgwick at bay.
And all of this counts on your enemy being too timid, not being aggressive, which was a good gamble by Lee in this case because Hooker was not particularly aggressive once the battle started. He was, there are times when there were decent plans, but they were executed poorly. Hooker's plan was a good plan. Burnside's plan at Fredericksburg in December of 1862 was a good plan, but it got bungled in the execution. And that's what happens with Chancellorsville.
At the time, there were 70,000 Union soldiers over 4 corps who had moved into the Virginia wilderness facing east. If Lee divided his army to attack those advancing Union forces in the woods, the main risk was that Sedgwick would advance and crush the small number of troops he left behind. Lee decided to take that risk.
And this is a famous, it looks like it's an engraving of a famous incident that happens where they call it the bivouac, and it's actually marked on the Chancellorsville battlefield because a guy from Jackson's staff went back years later and put markers on key points on the battlefield, including the spot where this happened. And this is where they come up with the final plan, and it's the last time that Lee and Jackson will ever see each other.
Ordered Jackson to lead the troops to the west, troops who in the dead of night were unsure of what exactly was going on. William Calder, a soldier in the 2nd North Carolina Infantry, recorded the movement this way: "We had no idea where we were going. A soldier never knows where he's going, nor what he's going to do until the moment for action comes."
And especially with Stonewall Jackson, because Stonewall Jackson was a guy who was known to not tell even his subordinate generals what was going on until they absolutely needed to know. He was very concerned about leaks, about intelligence failures, things like that. And so when Jackson gets mortally wounded, how much did his subordinates know about what they were supposed to be doing at that point?
They have only to trust in their commanders. On we went, through mud and over stumps, stumbling about in the dark, to the great danger of our heads and our shins. All the while, Union generals were congratulating one another. Bands played upbeat songs as soldiers cheered. But by the morning of May 1st, the mood changed. Jackson's army, advancing to the west, ran into Union brigades from the 5th Corps and 12th Corps, catching Hooker off guard. Although the Union maintained a numerical advantage, Hooker ordered his soldiers to pull back. Union generals couldn't believe Hooker's orders. In fact, Major General Henry Slocum who was in charge of the 12th Corps, called the orders crazy and threatened to shoot the messenger who delivered the news.
See, this is what I'm saying. This was a failure at the top of the chain of command. These subordinates, guys like Hancock and Meade, who commanded the 5th Corps, and Slocum commanding the 12th Corps, Hancock commanded the 2nd Corps, I think. They were just beside themselves because they understood that this was a winnable battle and that they had huge advantages.
But ultimately, the generals obeyed. Hooker was still convinced that he was in the superior strategic position, but Lee was not done yet. Jackson proposed yet another secret flanking maneuver, taking his entire corps.
By the way, the AI images here are terrible because they've got the shoulder bars here, which were worn by Union generals at this point, not Confederates. And Stonewall Jackson would have been a 3-star general, and Lee was a 4-star general at this point.
And leaving behind only 14,000 men. Around 5 a.m. on May 2nd, Lee authorized Jackson to take the entire 2nd Corps, 15 infantry brigades consisting of 30,000 soldiers and more than 100 cannon around the Union's right flank. In the fog of war, Jackson was able to snake around the Union forces undetected.
I wouldn't say undetected. For example, Dan Sickles' 3rd Corps spotted them, and he actually fired on them. But they did detect them. They knew they were moving. They just thought they were retreating. At least that was what Hooker decided. And you have the 11th Corps under Oliver Howard over on the right flank in the air, so to speak. In other words, they hadn't prepared for the possibility of an attack on that side, and their flank was unprotected.
The help of scouts and locals who mapped out a route in the wooded terrain. In his final dispatch to General Lee, Jackson wrote, "The enemy has made a stand at Chancellorsville, which is about 2 miles from Chancellorsville. I hope as soon as practicable to attack. I trust that an ever-kind Providence will bless us with great success. Respectfully, T.J. Jackson."
Yeah, both sides thought that God was on their side.
At 5:30 p.m., horse artillery positioned near the turnpike fired off 2 signal shots, which were followed by bugle calls. Jackson's corps emerged suddenly from the woods. 12,000 soldiers from the Union's 11th Corps were taken completely by surprise. Many of their trenches were facing the south, not the west, where the Confederate surprise attack was coming from. Very quickly, the Union forces were pushed back about 3 miles. But they weren't completely defeated. It was dark, and they were in the woods, which complicated Jackson's efforts to crush them. Jackson decided to push forward anyway and headed north to cut off the Union retreat. In fact, Jackson himself, along with some other officers, rode out ahead of the Confederate line to get a better sense for what the Union Army was doing.
It was raining, it was dark, and they foolishly rode out in front of their own lines at night.
Jackson was wounded by friendly fire and died 8 days later. Jackson's profound final words were documented by the historian Shelby Foote.
And he called the doctor and says, "Dr. McGuire, my wife tells me I'm going to die today. Is that true?" And the doctor said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "Good, very good.
It was a Sunday.
I always wanted to die on a Sunday."
Lee appointed Jeb
Those were not his last words. His last words were like he was delirious. He was, he had his arm amputated. He survived that okay, but then he got pneumonia. And he was calling out orders. He was talking about different things. And then he got real peaceful and said, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees."
Stewart to replace Jackson, ordering him to press the attack. And as Lee put it, quote, "It is necessary that the glorious victory thus far achieved be prosecuted with the utmost vigor, and the enemy given no time to rally. As soon, therefore, as it is possible, they must be pressed so that we may unite the 2 wings of the army. Endeavor, therefore, to dispossess them of Chancellorsville, which will permit the union of the whole army. I shall myself proceed to join you as soon as I can, make arrangements on this side, but let nothing delay the completion of the plan of driving the enemy from his rear and from his positions. I shall give orders that every effort be made on this side at daybreak to aid in the junction."
I'm just wondering so far. I mean, I know we got a long way to go. We've got 55 minutes left in this video, but it feels I'm trying to figure out, in telling the real history of the Civil War, why we're spending so much time just on Chancellorsville, other than we're highlighting a snapshot of the best possible moment for Lee. But that's what we do, right? You know, if we want people to form an opinion of us, we want to give them our highlights. Here's my highlight reel. You know, if you're trying to get a football scholarship, you don't send the coach of the team you're hoping to get a scholarship from, you don't send them the mistakes that you made. You don't send them, if you're a wide receiver, the moments that you dropped the pass. You send them the brilliant one-armed diving catch you made in the end zone. That's what this is. Chancellorsville is Robert E. Lee's brilliant diving one-armed catch. So if we're making the argument that Robert E. Lee was brilliant and he's the guy, this is absolutely where you want to spend your time, is on something like Chancellorsville.
May 3rd, Stewart led brutal frontal assaults on critical positions, including the high ground of Hazel Grove, with the goal of reuniting the Confederate Army.
And Hazel Grove is where, that's the area where I was talking earlier about Dan Sickles' 3rd Corps.
The attack was immediately effective. In order to prevent another Confederate flanking maneuver, Hooker made the fateful decision to abandon the high ground on Hazel Grove, ordering Sickles to fall back with the rest of the Union forces.
He was out of it, Hooker was.
It was a pivotal blunder, and yet another cautious decision while Lee was pursuing a much more aggressive strategy.
And it's interesting to me that in arguing how brilliant Lee was, I think he's being very fair and also highlighting how incompetent some of these decisions were by Union High Command in this battle. And that's what it takes, as I said earlier. Napoleon wasn't Napoleon simply because he was a brilliant general. He also had luck and success because at times he faced less than stellar opponents. Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant had the same privilege.
It's important to emphasize how important Hazel Grove was as an artillery platform.
Yes.
As Chris Mikowski writes in that
Hey, he's quoting Mikowski.
And
those are my friends, Chris Mikowski and Chris White. I know both those guys. Wonderful guys. They definitely know their stuff. Highly recommend anything that they produce.
70 square mile sea of trees that made up the wilderness, there were few open plots of ground, making the wilderness a terrible place to deploy artillery.
And he's talking about the wilderness. The wilderness, we think of the 1864 battlefield, but it's literally right. I mean, the wilderness and Chancellorsville, are next door neighbors to each other. There's just a couple of miles between the two battlefields.
Ground like Hazel Grove was invaluable. Being on higher ground increases a gun's range while also making the gun harder to hit with counter battery fire.
Yep.
The Confederates immediately rushed dozens of guns onto Hazel Grove and unloaded on the Union lines, forcing them to pull back.
And this is part of the mindset of Dan Sickles a few months later at Gettysburg, when he, without orders his corps forward to the Peach Orchard because it was higher ground than the ground that he had on Cemetery Ridge. And he's thinking about what happened back at Hazel Grove.
Cover fire allowed the Confederate Army to reunite, as Lee had ordered. It also had a direct impact on the leadership of the Union Army.
Here it is.
Hooker was injured when a Confederate cannonball struck the porch where he was standing at his command center, splintering a piece of wood that fell and hit him. Hooker was never removed from command, nor did his subordinates attempt to replace him, but he was clearly dazed at the worst possible moment.
Listen, I need to just acknowledge this, and this doesn't mean the rest of the video is going to be this way. I think so far this has been a very balanced and fair view of the events that he's covering.
Right when his forces were divided and the fighting was fiercest. But at the same time, Sedgwick broke through the Confederate battle lines at Fredericksburg, specifically Marye's Heights, posing a direct and unopposed threat to the rear of Lee's lines. When Lee heard the news, he was stoic. In response to a chaplain who was panicking after bringing word of the advancing Union Army, Lee said simply, "Thank you very much, but both you and your horse are overheated. Take him to that shady tree yonder and
calm
rest
yourself."
Lee ultimately decided to split his army for a third time. He sent the 2nd Corps under Brigadier General Raleigh Colston to strike Hooker, and he ordered McLaws' division to march east to fight Sedgwick. Fighting had broken out in 3 key areas: Salem Church, Fredericksburg, and the Chancellorsville Crossroads. Eventually, Lee rode out to Salem Church to lead the counterattack on Sedgwick directly. He successfully prevented the Union pincer movement once again by dividing his forces. Outmaneuvered, stunned, and physically injured, Hooker ordered a full retreat on the night of May 4th. Lee, by repeatedly dividing his forces when conventional wisdom called for retreating each time, had managed to defeat a much larger army at a time when both the Union and the Confederacy were eager for a major victory. Lee's tactics are still studied today in military academies. He recognized his opponent's strategic weakness and his opponent's fear, and he exploited them both.
Yep.
When the war broke out, no one thought it would last long. One person who knew it wouldn't be short was Robert E. Lee. In early 1861, while still in the U.S. Army at Fort Mason, Texas, he correctly predicted that if it came to armed conflict, quote, the war will last at least 4 years. He was right. Lee's foresight in recognizing the Civil War's potential for protracted devastation, unlike the naive optimism of many on both sides.
And yet, you know who else thought it would be a long war was William Tecumseh Sherman. And he was a guy who a lot of people viewed as insane because he kept saying that it was going to be bloody and awful.
Underscored his wisdom and his realism. His perfect battle at Chancellorsville showcased Lee's military prowess. The South didn't have the North's industrial capacity, railroads, wealth, or population.
All true.
But it had some of the greatest military leadership in human history.
Wouldn't go that far. I mean, human history, come on. I mean, I'm not downplaying any of these guys. All excellent generals. All definitely had weak spots. I mean, I've done a podcast on Stonewall Jackson for a more balanced view on him, if you're interested in that.
In other words, Lee and the South, well, they were no losers.
They were, though. Being a good general doesn't make you not a loser. I mean, those are two different things.
When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in April 1861, an immediate question arose. What should the conflict be called? Now, the answer wasn't obvious. On April 15th, President Lincoln issued Proclamation 80, which referred to the attack on Sumter and various state secessions as, quote, combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. In a July 4th message to Congress, Lincoln referred to the war as, quote, a case of rebellion. He continued to use the...
But he also, in his first inaugural address back in March of 1861, called it a civil war. He said, in your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, lies the momentous question of civil war.
Term rebellion throughout the war,
but it was a
the
rebellion.
Emancipation Proclamation, where he mentioned the rebellion against the United States. The words were political in nature. The Constitution conferred Lincoln emergency powers if he called it a rebellion.
Correct.
It also denied legitimacy to the South, implying that they were still part of the country. In 1880, when the War Department released the official records of the war, they titled it The War of the Rebellion, a compilation of the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. During the war, the South had its own preferred terms, like the War for Southern Independence and the War between the states. After the First Battle of Manassas, Confederate General Stonewall Jackson told his troops, I hope by your future deeds and bearing you'll be handed down to posterity as the 1st Brigade in this, our second war of independence.
Yeah, he was addressing the Stonewall Brigade after he'd been promoted. Listen, if we're going to offer an analysis of it, it was a rebellion. A civil war would really be where you have two competing ideologies or political viewpoints fighting for control of the whole country. But it's semantics, really, right? I mean, you can define civil war in such a way that it applies to this, but rebellion is also appropriate.
Farewell. Harris von Bork, Chief of Staff to Confederate General Jeb Stuart, titled his book, Memoirs of the Confederate War for Independence. Now, whether it was a rebellion or a war for independence depends on who you ask, but it certainly was not a civil war. Civil wars are between two sides that want to control the country.
Okay, usually, but hold on a second. So Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines it as a war between opposing groups of citizens of the same country. So in that definition, that applies, right? If we are saying that the Southerners were citizens of the United States who were fighting a war to break away and form their own country and were rebelling against the government of the United States, they are citizens. And Lincoln all along said that they were citizens of the United States and that they, had chosen to, break away, but they would be restored to their citizenship when the war was over. So that applies. I think civil war is still a proper definition. I just don't know why we need to be so caught up in that.
The Russian Civil War was between whites and reds over who would control the Russian Empire. The Chinese Civil War was between communists and nationalists over who would control China. The English Civil War was between parliamentary forces and the king over who would have supreme power over England. There's no evidence whatsoever the South had any interest in occupying or controlling Boston or New York or the entire country. They wanted to leave the Union for various reasons, which they believed they had the legal right to do. The matter at hand was whether the United States was a collection of sovereign states or a centralized union of subordinate states. That wasn't really a question in the early years of the Republic. According to Catherine Drinker Bowen's book, Miracle at Philadelphia, when the Constitutional Convention's Committee of Style and Arrangement originally drafted the preamble, it had no reference to "we the people of the United States." In fact, what the articles drafted by the convention had said was, quote, "we the undersigned delegates of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, etc." and so on down the list of the 13. But they scrapped that idea because it was unlikely that they would get all 13 states to ratify the new Constitution. So,
well, here's the thing. They're coming into the Constitutional Convention having lived with the Articles of Confederation since independence. And the Articles of Confederation were just not working because it was too loose a system that basically treated the 13 states as sovereign states. And it just wasn't working. And so the Constitutional Convention was to rectify that by creating a stronger central government. Now, there was a lot of debate about how strong that central government should be, how much power and influence and authority it should have. And the primary folks who didn't want it to have a lot were in the South, from Virginia in particular, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, folks like that.
The real history of how the term "we the people" was born is that it was a technicality. Back then, you wouldn't have said, "the United States is a place." You would have said, "these United States are a place." And that is a very important distinction.
I think we make a little too much of that, and I hope we're not going to get bogged down in a bunch of semantics about the debate about whether it said "we the undersigned delegates" or "we the people." None of that has any bearing on the legalities of the Union. That's not the place to make that argument.
In that context, it's not surprising that by 1794, just 6 years after the Constitution's ratification, 2 U.S. senators, Rufus King of New York and Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, approached Senator John Taylor of Virginia and informed him they wanted to break up the Union already. They recognized a huge divide between the northern and southern states, and it wasn't just cultural differences.
That existed before 1794. That divide was there when they made the Constitution in 1787. That's why there were so many compromises. That's why things got put in there that really would come back to haunt us, because you had such a difference in not only the view of the role of government, but just the nature of the states, where you have emerging industrial power in the north and very agrarian rural society in the south.
Between the agrarian south and the urbanized north, they noticed major political and economic differences too.
Yeah, absolutely.
In 1883, more than 2 decades after the outbreak of the war, Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts acknowledged that everybody involved in the ratification of the Constitution would have assumed states could leave, writing, quote, "When the Constitution was adopted by the votes of states at Philadelphia and accepted by the votes of states in popular conventions, it is safe to say that there was not a man in the country, from Washington and Hamilton on the one side to George Clinton and George Mason on the other, who regarded the new system as anything but an experiment entered upon by the
I don't know if Hamilton viewed it that way. I think he thought it was pretty binding.
States, and from which each and every state had the right peaceably to withdraw, a right which was very likely to be exercised." The historical record proves this point. Between the founding of the country in 1861, northern states threatened to secede at least 5 times. In 1803, a group of Massachusetts-based Federalists known as the Essex Junto threatened to secede because they feared the Louisiana Purchase would dilute their political power.
Threatened to. Didn't actually do it. That's the difference between what happened in 1860 and what happened in these other examples.
Aaron Burr, who was Thomas Jefferson's vice president, was their leader.
There
in
you go.
1807, they threatened to leave again.
Aaron Burr wanted power, and he couldn't get it, so he was willing to lead a rebellion, lead a secession to get it.
And after Jefferson put an embargo on Great Britain and France, during the War of 1812, New England once again threatened to secede because of the British blockade of their ports. Some states considered independently making peace with the British. Massachusetts and Connecticut refused to place their militias under federal command. They claimed the federal government didn't have the power to do it.
Right.
In the 1840s, northern politicians published a solemn appeal to the peoples of free states, arguing that the annexation of Texas will be, quote, so injurious to the interests and abhorrent to the feelings of the people of the free states as, in our opinion, not only inevitably to result in a dissolution of the Union, but fully to justify it. Former President John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts signed that document. After the 1850 passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, New England threatened to nullify the law, and some leaders called for secession again. Before the Civil War...
Again, these are all people calling for things, people saying this might be a good idea. It never got to the place where you had a real movement. You didn't have states across New England voting on secession. It never got anywhere near that.
The North issued credible threats to secede at least 5 separate times. As the great Civil War historian Shelby Foote put it, quote, if the states had known that they couldn't get out, they never would have gotten in.
All right, looks like we're moving on to Chapter 3. We'll go ahead and do Chapter 3, and then I think we'll wrap it up for this episode.
Robert E. Lee witnessed the 1860 election results from a U.S. Army post in San Antonio, Texas. As the fervor over secession began to boil over, Lee wrote his father-in-law, quote, if the Union is dissolved, which God in his mercy forbid, I shall return to you. According to historian Alan Guelzo,
his father-in-law was dead in 1860. His father-in-law was George Washington Parke Custis, who I believe died in 1857. He was the owner of Arlington House, which is where Arlington National Cemetery is today. Let's take a look. He was the adopted son of George Washington. Yeah, he died in October of 1857, so I think we're getting our timeline a little confused here.
As the states of the Deep South left the Union, Lee complained that the behavior of the Cotton states was wholly beyond any justification, and he was worried that their selfish and dictatorial bearing would make life for Virginia miserable should she determine to coalesce with them.
So he's talking about the Cotton states because initially the secession is the Deep South. These are the states that rely heaviest on the institution of slavery because they heavily have a lot of cotton plantations, which is where slavery is the most profitable in the South. So you're talking about Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas.
In a letter to one of his cousins, he wrote, secession is revolution.
Yep.
He wrote that, quote, our people will destroy a government inaugurated by the blood and wisdom of our patriot fathers that has given us peace and prosperity at home, power and security abroad, and under which we have acquired a colossal strength unequaled in the history of mankind. According to Guelzo, Lee wished to live under no other government and to have no other flag than the Star-Spangled Banner. But if that government was now going to disappear, then the only alternative was to go back in sorrow to my people and share the misery of my native land.
Yeah, at this point, it wasn't really clear that Virginia would secede, and Lincoln, even before he comes to office in March of 1861, is working behind the scenes trying to keep states like Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas, Kentucky, Maryland from seceding from the Union.
Like so many Americans from this period, Lee was a patriotic American and a war hero.
True.
But he saw himself, first and foremost, as a Virginian. On February 6, 1861, David Twiggs, the commander of the U.S. Army's Department of Texas, surrendered his entire command to the Confederates and ordered all federal troops to abandon their posts. Lee refused to leave Fort Mason and pledged to defend his post at all hazards. This is because the legality of secession mattered to him, and because his native Virginia hadn't seceded yet. As he left Texas, Lee declared he was returning to Virginia to resign and go to planting corn. And though he would never bear arms against the U.S., he might carry a musket in defense of my native state, Virginia.
Which would require you to bear arms against the U.S. I get it, and I understand Lee's choice, and I'm not condemning Lee's choice to defend his home. That's what a lot of these guys were doing. Lee very much opposed the idea of secession. He didn't want it to happen, and I understand the dilemma that he faced in Virginia siding the way that it did. But you can't simultaneously argue, I won't bear arms against the United States, but oh, by the way, I will pick up a musket and defend Virginia against the Army of the United States.
Lee's attitude tells us a lot about why not one single Confederate leader was ever convicted of treason, because it was commonly understood at the time that it was not treason. The legal case for secession goes...
No, it was, I mean, if you read the writings of people, if you read the newspapers, they were absolutely viewed as traitors. 100% they were viewed as traitors. The decision not to prosecute after the war was a conscious political decision to try and bring reconciliation and follow Lincoln's lead, to let him up easy, so to speak. It was not because they didn't legally see it as treason. Do not think for a moment that these men were not viewed as traitors, because they absolutely were viewed as traitors.
It goes back to before the Constitution, when 13 U.S. colonies decided to secede from the British Crown. After winning their war for independence, those colonies then formed the Articles of Confederation, which required that any changes to the Union be adopted by the Congress in all the states. But that never happened, and most states just seceded. The background led historian Charles Francis Adams Jr., who served as a colonel in the Union Army, to say, quote, "If Robert E. Lee was a traitor, so also indisputably were George Washington, Oliver Cromwell, John Hampden, and William of Orange."
Yes, that's true. George Washington was absolutely a traitor. I don't know why that's a controversial opinion.
Adams goes on, "George Washington furnishes a precedent at every point. A Virginian like Lee, he was also a British subject. He had fought under the British flag, as Lee had fought under that of the United States."
George Washington led colonial militia. He still fought under the British flag. And I'm again, semantics. No, it's absolutely true. And it's understandable then why Virginians like Robert E. Lee would model themselves after George Washington and say, you know what? Men like George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that when the people decide that the government that has been instituted among men is no longer working for them, it is their right to alter or abolish it. And they were viewing that they were doing exactly that. But they still fought a war against an opponent who wanted to keep them as part of the country. So the same thing's happening here. The difference between George Washington and Robert E. Lee is that Washington, his war was won, and so we got independence.
When, in 1776, Virginia seceded from the British Empire, he went with his state, just as Lee went with it 85 years later. Subsequently, Washington commanded armies in the field designated by those opposed to them as rebels, and whose descendants now glorify them as the rebels of 76, much as Lee later commanded and at last surrendered much larger armies, also designated rebels by those they confronted. Except in their outcome, the cases were therefore precisely alike, and logic is logic.
But let's also understand that the argument made by the 1776 rebels was that, hey, we are not being represented. We have taxation without representation. That was the rallying cry, right? That we don't have the opportunity to have a say in our government. And the South couldn't say that. The South lost the argument. Their reason for seceding was that they could see the writing on the wall that slavery, because you have Abraham Lincoln getting elected, and Abraham Lincoln is the first president being elected from this brand new Republican Party, who has as a platform stopping the expansion of slavery to new territories. In other words, any new states that are admitted to the Union will be free states. That's their policy. They were not, as a party, abolitionists. There were many abolitionists within the Republican Party. But Lincoln did not run on a platform of abolition. He ran on a platform of stopping the expansion. But the Confederacy understood that for the last 80 years, the United States has operated under this policy of balance. And, when we bring in a new slave state, we bring in a new free state, so that the balance of power between slave and free states in the voting representation remains the same, so that the status quo will stay and nothing major will happen to the institution of slavery. Republicans getting power threatened that, and they viewed that as new free states would be entered and not new slave states, eventually the balance would tip to the point where slavery would be abolished 10, 20, 30 years down the road, and they weren't going to tolerate that. So they had representation, they just didn't like the outcome of the election. And they said, well, I'm taking my ball and going home. So there is a difference. Yes, both rebels fighting for very different things.
So the only difference is that Washington won his war and Lee lost his. The courts basically agreed with that analysis. After the Civil War, many northern newspapers...
They didn't, though, because you had Texas versus White, which ruled that secession was illegal.
Including the Boston Daily Advertiser and the New York Times, published materials encouraging the government to put Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, on trial for treason. And for their part, the Philadelphia Inquirer wrote that a trial would, quote, render traitors infamous and have it judicially settled that secession is illegal.
And you know what? In hindsight, we probably should have been a lot harder on the South, the defeated South, than we were. Having Andrew Johnson as president and the leniency that he brought with him toward some of this, maybe some of the next 100 years of Jim Crow and segregation and the awful things that were done to the freedmen, as they were called, maybe some of that could have been avoided if we had hanged a few more traitors.
We would have learned a lot about the country if they would have done it. According to University of Virginia law professor Cynthia Nicoletti, no one knew for sure whether secession was legal and that any treason prosecution would rise and fall on that question. Indeed, she quotes George Washington Woodward, Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, who wrote in a letter to a lawyer representing a Confederate senator, quote, "The doctrine of state rights will have a severe test and may find a strange vindication in that trial. Secession has yet to be defined. Hitherto, it has been a toy of politicians, and they have dodged everything like a definition.
Here's the funny thing about states' rights. The South only was concerned with states' rights when it came to the rights that they believed in, because they were just beside themselves angry that, for example, they couldn't do more to force Ohio to enforce their slavery laws and to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. So they were fine with violating the sovereignty of other states when it benefited them.
Treason? That's a grand question. If it is not, war in support of it cannot be. If the right to withdraw existed, it must have included the right of defense, so that levying war to defend a confederacy founded in secession could not be levying war against the government of the U.S.
But defending the Confederacy and firing on a federal fort in Charleston Harbor are not the same thing. Now, some of you are going to hear me say that and say, well, wait a second. Well, that fort was in Charleston Harbor, was in South Carolina. Therefore, South Carolina should have owned it. No, they didn't, though. It was federal property. It was a federal fort, and those were federal soldiers. They were American soldiers that were fired on in a fort in federal property. So however you parse it, and yes, you can make the argument, and I agree with you, that Lincoln may have maneuvered things to provoke that to happen, but the bottom line is the Confederacy started that war not to defend themselves, but they fired on a fort that was occupied in a harbor outside of one of their major cities.
But this is on the assumption that secession is something less than treason, which I neither aver nor deny. Many Northern politicians were certain the government would lose. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, who was most famous for getting caned on the Senate floor, said to try Jefferson Davis would be the ne plus ultra of folly. The Supreme Court's Chief Justice said, if you bring these Confederate leaders to trial, it will condemn the North, for by the Constitution, secession is not rebellion.
Listen, Salmon Chase, not one of my favorite people in the world, even though he's from Ohio. There were plenty of others who had the opinion that you should and could try them for secession. So, yes, all of what he's portraying here is accurate to what these people said. But this was not the only view. There were plenty of people who viewed viewed it the other way, that secession is illegal. And that's eventually how the Supreme Court ruled, was that secession was illegal. There were people who viewed that they should put these guys on trial for treason.
Nicoletti writes that even Lincoln himself was concerned about the possibility that a trial might backfire. Quote, before his untimely death, President Lincoln had remarked that Davis's flight from Richmond in April was a good thing because it forestalled the political and legal difficulties that might attend a high-profile treason prosecution. I'm bound to oppose the escape of Jeff Davis, Lincoln had reportedly told General William T. Sherman. But if you could manage to have him slip out unbeknownst, I guess it wouldn't hurt me much.
But that was Lincoln's attitude toward the whole thing. He wanted to restore the South, and anything that would have made that more complicated, he was willing to go along with. He didn't want Jefferson Davis to be arrested and tried because that was going to complicate the restoration of the Union.
At a cabinet meeting at the White House on July 18th, there was no consensus at the White House as to how to proceed. President Andrew Johnson, who assumed office after Lincoln's assassination, pressed for a clear answer, but he didn't get one. The Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, stated that there was, quote, a great diversity of opinion in the matter as to whether Davis should be tried first for the crime of high treason. Ultimately, Andrew Johnson opted to proceed tentatively with a treason prosecution. For his part, Davis was eager for trial because he believed secession was legal and he wanted vindication in court.
Right, and so then there's the argument to be made as well. Let's not give Jefferson Davis a platform for all of this by giving him a trial.
Davis, in fact, hoped that he would be arrested in 1861 after his home state of Mississippi seceded so that he could demonstrate the legality of secession. But no one arrested him, and he instead was chosen to be president of the new Confederate States of America. That's why Davis, unlike Robert E. Lee, never requested a presidential pardon. He genuinely thought that he'd be vindicated in court. Jefferson Davis was charged with treason and held for 2 years at Fort Monroe in Virginia, but never got his day in court. Over time, popular support for prosecution waned, and the Johnson administration was far from certain that a Virginia jury would convict Davis, or even that the Supreme Court would definitively rule that secession was illegal. Davis took the surrender as an unequivocal win. Quote, a sovereign state cannot commit treason, he wrote. The government early discovered that if this issue came before the Supreme Court, it would lose its case, and I should be acquitted.
But the issue did, again, I've said this a couple times now, it did come before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did rule that it was illegal.
So none of the indictments were ever tried. Shortly after Davis's case was dropped in April of 1869, the Supreme Court ruled in a separate, unrelated case, Texas v. White, that secession is indeed unconstitutional. As the court put it, the Constitution in all its provisions looks to an indestructible union composed of indestructible states. But it was a throwaway line in a case about bonds. There wasn't any significant discussion of secession during oral arguments or briefing. And the ruling attracted virtually no media attention because by that point it seemed like a dead issue.
It was.
In short, the Supreme Court snuck in a ruling about the unconstitutionality of secession years after the lengthy public debate over Davis's trial made clear that, in fact, there was no consensus on that point in the country. And there still isn't, by the way. The America of the 17th and 18th centuries was very different from the United States we know today. At the time, even many Northerners would have conceded that, at the minimum, the constitutionality of secession was a close call.
Many would, but when you look at the overwhelming support for the war to subdue the rebellion and restore the Union by the North, look at the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men who flocked to sign up in the summer and fall of 1861 to put down the rebellion, and tell me that they didn't believe the Union should be restored. Tell me they didn't view the Southerners as traitors. I just wrote a book, Trumbull County Boys, and obviously Northeast Ohio was one of the most pro-Union parts of the country, but the word traitor is repeatedly used in the letters that these guys wrote home. Restoring the Union. They viewed the people they were fighting as traitors and rebels. They viewed the people back home who spoke against the war and wanted peace and wanted to allow the Confederacy to have its own country. They viewed them as traitors. So, yes, was there strong divided opinion in the North about this? Yeah, but let's not act like there weren't millions of people who viewed secession as illegal and the Union as indestructible, because that absolutely was true.
And that it would be a gross oversimplification, if not an outright falsehood, to call these men traitors.
All right, so I actually agreed with him a lot more than I thought I would in that one. I found it to be fairly balanced, though I don't know if we're building up to something in the second half. I guess we'll find out when we get to that next part in the next episode. In the meantime, I want to thank my friends John Valenti and Joe Matthews, who, when you guys watch this, I will be with them in Scotland. So looking forward to seeing my friends there. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and be watching for part 2. Turn on your notifications so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.